Hello, Dr. Grafals again, and today I begin framing our discussion of Aimé Césaire's masterwork, Notebook of Return to the Native Land, or Cahier d'un retour au pays natal. You'll want to turn on the subtitles as I cite references from the poem and secondary material on Césaire. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this poem and the figure of Aimé Césaire in Caribbean thought, there's this moment of testimony in Frantz Fanon's classic book, Black Skin, White Mask. Remember, Frantz Fanon was one of the key thinkers referenced by Catherine McKittrick. He was a psychiatrist and a philosopher of decolonization who was actually taught by Aimé Césaire when Aimé was a teacher in a secondary school in Martinique. In Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon states, quote, "A European familiar with the current trends of black poetry would be amazed to learn that as late as 1940, no Caribbean was capable of thinking of himself as black. It was only with Aimé Césaire that we witnessed the birth and acceptance of negritude and its demands. The most visible proof of this is the impression the young generation of students get when they arrive in Paris. It takes a few weeks for them to realize that their contact with Europe compels them to face a number of problems which up till then had never crossed their mind." End of quote. Fanon is referring to his own experience as a young scholar in Paris, but he may as well be referring to Aimé Césaire himself, who studied in Paris in the 1930s. In Paris, Césaire would first come in contact with a transnational community of black thinkers from all sides of the Atlantic. He became friends with writers like Léon Damas from Guyana, then a French colony in South America, and Léopold Senghor from Senegal, then a French colony of Africa. These black thinkers shaped his perspective in terms of a new diasporic understanding of black identity, and together they would go on to publish the literary review L'étudiant Noir, or the Black Student. We can argue then that it's this encounter with a transnational black diaspora that would shape the global vision we find in a book like Notebook of Return to a Native Land. With Léopold Senghor, who would later go on to become the first president of Senegal, Césaire inaugurates the negritude literary movement. Indeed, the word negritude first emerges in poetry in Césaire's notebook. Aimé Césaire's conception of negritude, or black consciousness, would go on to influence the identity of third world writers in both the Caribbean and Africa. While his friend Senghor would articulate a conception of negritude that was largely essentialist, for Césaire, negritude was something to be understood in historical terms. As he states in an interview, quote, "There's no predetermined negritude. There is no essence. There's only history, a living history." End of quote. While influenced by the U.S. Harlem Renaissance, including writers like Langston Hughes and the Jamaican-born Claude McKay, Césaire was also influenced by French Surrealism. Poets like Arthur Rimbaud and André Breton. Surrealism was important to Césaire's poetics. He's reaching for new forms of expression beyond rational scientific discourse that can animate his own unique relation to the world. So when he writes his notebook, he's using a European modernist form, but transforming it in a radical way, unlike the way Alejo Carpentier would go on to shape the term el real maravilloso, marvelous realism. So the notebook first appears in 1939 in a journal called Volonté in Paris. Césaire moves back to Martinique soon after, like the poetic eye, to Martinique. He works as a high school teacher where he teaches thinkers like Frantz Fanon. He becomes the first mayor of Fort-de-France after World War II and becomes a leading statesman of Martinique until the 1990s. The poem Notebook of Return to the Native Land actually has many different versions. The versions we read is closer to the one published in book form in 1947, which expands the text by the addition of, for instance, the first stanza, where the poetic eye tells figures of authority to beat it, with the addition of political references like the invocation of the outcast Jew, the outcast Hindu, the outcast Harlem on pages 11 to 12. The first version is actually heavier on religious imagery, and it's actually much tighter in structure. A translation came out recently in 2013, and there's still debate at which one's better, although I do love some of the additions in the 1947 version. But I recommend reading the earlier version quite highly. So now let's see about wrapping our heads around the structure of the text. So we can divide the text into 3 movements. After an initial burst of energy of the first stanza, the first movement's tone becomes much more downcast, as a poem reviews the negative geographic spaces of Martinique. The poem describes the town and the people as poor, alienated, and lacking a real identity. We're even witness to the speaker's family in a short-lived Christmas celebration that helps but ultimately fails to affirm identity in the midst of this downtrodden space. The second movement can be said to begin on page 13, when the poetic subject is spurred on by the desire to go away from the island, yet in hopes of returning to grant a new, positive identity to his people in space. We can say that in this movement, there's a passage through Europe, a passage through the violence of colonial history, but there's also passages through multiple identities. At times there's bursts of enthusiasm where the voice feels elated at the rediscovery of identity, but there are moments of dejection, low points that pull the poet's voice to depths of negativity. Perhaps the most notable low point is when the speaker encounters a poor black man on a streetcar or trolley on pages 29 to 31. It's a moment where the speaker confesses to his cowardice, to an internalized racism that still afflicts the subject. But just when we think of the speaker has reached the depths of a kind of dark night of the soul, there begins a third movement. The third movement can be said to begin on page 33 with the lines, quote, "But what strange pride suddenly illuminates me," end of quote. The movement rushes forward to this imaginative reconquest of the middle passage, when the speaker goes back in time to revolt aboard a ship carrying enslaved Africans. The poem ends on this moment of transfiguration, when the speaker is carried upwards, wrapped by a lasso of stars. The poem ends with one of the great endings of 20th century poetry, quote, "And the great black hole where a moon ago I wanted to drown it is there where I will now fish the malevolent tongue of the night in its motionless virition." That last word, virition, is a neologism, a new word that is one of the most talked about words in Black poetics. As we discuss this poem this Friday, I want you to choose an angle approach that you want to write about. Let us brainstorm possible questions. How does the poetic subject engage with what McKittrick will go on to call Black geographies? How is the poem signaling a process of transformation that allows the subject to be connected to new global collectivities? What attitudes and conceptions of his own identity has to be interrogated and critiqued in order to affirm his identity anew? How is the articulation of poetic discourse important as a decolonizing practice? How does he go about transforming his dejected, negative homeland space into something worth celebrating? All these questions and more can help us get a deeper understanding of the text. You may want to read the poem more than once. I also encourage you to read out loud. The Clayton, Eshleman, and Annette Smith translation is a triumph in the art of translation. See if you can feel the movements and rhythms of the self that emerge in the poem. those ups and downs of affect, the enthusiasm of ideas, and deflations of self. If we could characterize this poem, it is a journey in time and space in hopes of rediscovering a new racial identity, a racial identity that gestures towards universality. I like to end with something Césaire said in an interview. Quote, "The West told us that in order to be universal, we had to start by denying that we were black. I, on the contrary, said to myself that the more we were black, the more universal we would be." Thank you. I'm looking forward to your comments. Bye-bye.